Hi, welcome to my channel, Math Made Easy with Laurel. I'm Laurel, and in this video we're going to talk about the difference between probability and odds. So people often confuse the two and think that they're the same thing. So I want to talk about the definition of each and then look at a number of examples to make it very clear how they compare. So we talked in the last video about the definition of probability. So if we looked at an event called A, the probability of it happening can be calculated by taking the number of ways in which the event can occur and dividing by the total number of possible outcomes. So for example, if we're rolling a die and we want to know what's the probability of rolling a 3, well, there's one way to roll a 3, but there are 6 possible outcomes. So the probability would be 1/6. The important thing to understand with probability is that it's going to be a number between 0 and 1. 0 means it's impossible and 1 means it's certain. So probability will be anywhere between 0 and 1. And once you have the probability, you could then express it as a percent. So if it was 0.57, that means a 57% likelihood of that event happening. Odds, on the other hand, can be thought of in 2 ways. One is the number of ways the event can occur compared to the number of ways the event cannot occur. If you know the probability of an event occurring, we could calculate the odds by using that probability that the event will occur and dividing it by the probability that the event will not occur. When you're expressing odds, it's like a ratio. You can write it either as a fraction or a ratio, but it's some number to some number. Let's take a look at some examples. If we were flipping a coin and our outcome is getting ahead when we flip the coin, the probability of that happening would be calculated by taking the number of ways it can happen while we're flipping one coin. So it's either a head or a tail. So there's one way to get ahead and 2 possible outcomes. As a decimal, that's 0.5, and as a percent, it's 50%. So we would say the probability of getting ahead when we flip a coin is 1/2 or 0.5, which is a 50% likelihood. Now, if we're calculating odds, we would take the number of ways to get ahead is 1. The number of ways not to get ahead, which means getting a tail, would be 1. So we could say the odds are 1-to-1. So let's say we roll a die and we want to calculate both the probability of getting a 4 and the odds for getting a 4. So the probability is 1. There's only one way to get a 4 out of how many possible outcomes? 6. So that would be 0.167 or 16.7% probability. If we are looking at the odds of rolling a 4, it's a little bit different. We're going to look at the number of ways to get a 4, which is 1, and that will be compared to the number of ways not to get a 4. So there's 5 other numbers that you can get. So the odds would be 1-to-5. We don't write it as a decimal. We write it as some number to some number. It could stay in fraction form or express it as a ratio, and I think people are more comfortable when they express it as a ratio. Another example, if we were choosing a card from a deck of cards and we wanted to choose a face card, which is either the Jack, Queen, or King, the probability of doing that is different than the odds of doing that. So if we want to know the probability, we have to figure out how many different ways can we choose a Jack, Queen, or King from a deck of cards. So because there are 4 suits, 3 times 4, there are 12 ways to choose a face card. Out of how many possible outcomes are there when we choose a card from a deck? 52. That reduces to 3/13, which is 0.231, and as a percent, 23.1%. So 23.1% of choosing a face card from a full deck of cards. Now let's talk about the odds of choosing a face card. So how many ways are there to choose a face card? There are 12. And then you compare that to how many ways there are not to choose a face card. So if we subtract 12 from 52, there's 40 cards that are not face cards. So 12 to 40, which we can reduce. 4 divides into both numbers, so 3 to 10. Once you've reduced it, you stop. You do not change it to a decimal. You want, when you're expressing odds, keep both numbers, and then you can write it as a ratio. So the probability of choosing a face card is 23.1%. The odds of choosing a face card are 3 to 10. Now let's talk about how you switch a probability to odds or odds to a probability. All right, let's start off with, given a probability, how do we change that to odds? And the best way to show it is with an example. I'll give a formula as well, but just to start with, let's look at an example. If the probability of a certain event happening is 0.75, let's subtract that from 1 to find out the probability of that event not happening. So in other words, if there's a 75% chance of it happening, that means there's a 25% chance of it not happening. So we subtract that from 1, or we subtract the percent from 100% to get the probability of it not happening. Now that we have these two probabilities, we can find the odds. To find the odds, we take the probability of the event happening, 0.75, divide that by the probability of that event not happening, and then we can reduce it. I'm going to just multiply by 100 to move my decimal point in both the numerator and the denominator. Just makes it a little bit easier to simplify. And then I'm going to reduce that. I can divide 25 into both numbers, which would be 3 over 1. So the odds of that event happening would be 3 to 1. One other thing I want to mention is sometimes you're going to see the odds for something and the odds against it. So what I'm dealing with is the odds for that thing happening. If you wanted to find the odds against, you would just flip the numbers. You would just take the reciprocal of this fraction. Now I'm going to show you the formula. To calculate odds, you take the probability of the event happening and you divide that by 1 minus the probability of it happening. So this represents the probability of it not happening. And that's exactly what we did in this example. Now let's take a look at converting odds to probability. So let's say we know the odds of a certain event happening are 2 to 3. So that means there are 2 ways for it to happen and 3 ways for it not to happen. Now if we add up 2 and 3, we get the total number of possibilities. So we're going to do that. So this is the total number of possible outcomes. Now technically there might be more outcomes because this might have been reduced, but we're just looking at it in its reduced form. So that means that the probability, there's 2 ways that the event can happen for every 5 possible outcomes. So that would be 0.4 or 40%. So an event that has odds of 2 to 3 would have a probability of 40%. There is a formula to calculate this. I find this a little confusing because odds are you going to be given as a fraction. So if we were to do that with this particular case, we're going to get into complex fractions and it gets a little bit messy. So if I add 2/3 plus 1, it will be 5/3. I multiply top and bottom by 3 and I get 2/5. And if I change that to a decimal, it's 0.4. So there is a formula that allows you to find probability when you know odds, but I kind of like to do it more instinctually than using this formula. The key thing to remember is probability has to be a number between 0 and 1, and odds have to be expressed as a ratio, either written in fraction form or in ratio form.